Hello. I want to make a video about why I left Booktube. I made Booktube videos from, I think, 2013 to 2016, and I enjoyed it. They're almost all privatized now. Anything with my face in it, I privatized. But I was watching some of my old videos back recently, and I was actually pleasantly surprised by them. They weren't as horrible as I remember, but it did make me think back on that time and why I left and what the effects that Booktube had on my reading and the effects that leaving had on my reading. So yes, hello, I am Tegan. I'm a recovering booktuber. So I've always been a really slow reader. In primary school, I was very slow to the point where I would get embarrassed, and we'd go to the school library, we'd pick out a book, and we'd go back to class, and we'd have reading time, and everyone would read. And I was very conscious of how long everyone was taking to finish their books, and I would pretend. I would be reading my book, and I'd pretend that I'd finished early because I was reading slower than everyone else, and I struggled with spelling in school, and I struggled with my reading speed, but that was kind of it. I was a really annoying smartass when I was a little kid. I was really good at primary school, like adding, subtracting, I was on it. I felt like being smart was part of my identity, and being a slow reader was the opposite of that, and it was this dirty secret that no one could know. And so I had this like real complex about being a slow reader. And later on in life, I basically just stopped reading. By the time I hit 13, I had joined high school at that point. The high school system is different in Australia. We don't have middle school, it just goes straight to high school. So I joined high school, and I basically just stopped reading. We didn't have, in-class reading time in the way you do in primary school. I felt like no one was really encouraging me to read in the way they do when you're a kid. And it was like sweet relief. It was like, oh, great, I don't have to read anymore. Because I had this complex of being a slow reader. It was like, oh, I guess it's just not for me. And so basically from the age of 12 or 13 to 18, which doesn't sound like that. That's what, like 5 years? But those are very important 5 years. A 13-year-old is a very different creature than an 18-year-old. I basically didn't read. I read what I was assigned in school for the most part, but I didn't read recreationally at all. And I just had accepted, guess I'm not a reader, which is a shame because I always kind of felt like the sort of person who was gonna be, but guess not. And then I was 18. This was around 2013, I think. No, 2012. And I think it was the Vlog Brothers. They had a book club for Fahrenheit 451. I was a big YouTube watcher. Way early on, I was watching YouTube back in 2008 when it was still weird to watch YouTube as much as I was. So I'd been following the Vlog Brothers for a while at that point, and I was like, you know what? Just for these blokes, I'm going to read this book. It was short, had big writing in it. I was like, okay. It had a big long word on the front, Fahrenheit, which I still don't know how to spell. I was like, okay, I'll try it. I bought it and I read it, and I absolutely loved it. I think I've done a video on Fahrenheit 451 and how it made me the reader I was. I read it, it just sucked me in, it made me think, it made me feel. The last act, the last third of that book was just so engaging for me. And I finished it and I was like, oh my gosh, is that what reading can be like? It wasn't weighed down in expectations from school. I wasn't comparing myself to other students around me. I could read it at my own pace, and I loved it. And I was like, yeah, give me some more of that. And because I'd been on YouTube a while, I knew that there'd be people talking about books on YouTube, and of course there was. Booktube was in its infancy at that time, but there were people doing it, mostly talking about YA. But I did find a couple. I think Rincey Reads was, I think, the first booktuber I ever found who read adult fiction, which even though I was still fairly young at 18, I just wasn't interested in YA. And I think that's another reason why I didn't read as a teenager, was because YA just didn't interest me at all. Never read the Percy Jackson books. They were very popular. I did read Harry Potter, but I read them all pre 12 years of age. You know, I started high school in 2007. That's when the last book was published, which I read, and that was kind of it. You know, Harry Potter for me is very much a childhood thing, not a teenagehood thing. So I'd had this wonderful experience with Fahrenheit 451, and I wanted more. So I found this YouTube community. I don't even know if it was dubbed BookTube at the time. It was so young, but I did find some people who weren't reading YA and were reading books that I'd never heard of, and I just started devouring things at the slow pace that I was able to. I was also picking up things that were just on people's shelves, you know, borrowing from my mum and picking up some things from the library, really trying to find my footing. I also started recording what I was reading at this stage. This was 2013, so I started reading it 2012. That's when I read Fahrenheit 451. 2013 was really when I found BookTube, started recording what I was reading, and started making videos myself, because I wanted to be involved. This was such an exciting time. I have fondness for it now, but to be honest, when I look back, because I still have the list of what I was reading, when I look back, I'm like, oh yeah, I really hadn't found my reading taste yet. I was reading things that I wouldn't read now because I know they didn't really do much for me, but I was finding my footing. I think Neil Gaiman is someone I remember reading a fair bit of back then. He was a great gateway author for me. Anyway, at the time there was a much stricter formula on BookTube in terms of videos. It was very regimented. It was book hauls, wrap-ups, occasionally individual reviews, maybe a bookshelf tour, and that was kind of it. You know, there might be a fun excursion video where someone will go to a bookstore and or that they might vlog themselves reading on a train or something. That was kind of it, and so that's what I did too. It's what I followed along with, and the BookTube video formula didn't suit my reading at all. But the problem was, I didn't really know that at the time. See, I became a reader and very soon afterwards found BookTube and began making videos. My reading life was very entangled with that BookTube formula. It kind of fused, and I didn't really know reading without it. I didn't realize that the formula wasn't working for me because my reading was so intertwined with it from the very start. So come 2016, I wasn't really enjoying making videos anymore, and I was like, you know what? I'm just going to step away from this. I'm just going to step away from making BookTube videos. It turned out to be fantastic. I learned a lot about myself as a reader from doing that, and that's what this video is about. There's a huge long intro, I apologize, but I wanted to share what I learned by stepping away from BookTube for many years. I mean, it's now what? I've been off BookTube for about as long as I was on it. So the first thing that I learned by stepping away was TBRs, right? That was a big video. You'd make your monthly TBR about all the books you wanted to read. And I did that for the 3 years that I was making videos. And by stepping away, I didn't make those anymore. And it was, what do you mean? What do you mean? I don't have a list of books I've predetermined for myself. I could read this book or that book. Or this one. And as soon as I finished the book, I got to decide the next book I could read right in that instant. It was such an infusion of excitement and like immediacy into my reading. I realized what it was to be a mood reader, and because at the time I didn't know these things. I started reading one book at a time for a long period of time, which when I was on BookTube, I was trying to read as much as I could to talk about as much as I could. So I was reading quite a few books at once. I loved reading one book at a time. I now tend to do 1 or 2 books at a time, but not much more than that. I really do like just focusing on the books I'm reading. And I find that if I'm reading too many at once now, I get kind of overwhelmed and I it lowers my enjoyment for all of them. Similarly, I also stopped listening to audiobooks. I was listening to audiobooks quite a bit when I was on BookTube because lots of other people were. It was exciting. I thought, like I said, I was just trying everything at the time because I was still finding my footing as a reader. But by stepping away from BookTube, I didn't feel that pressure to constantly be filling every moment of the day with reading. And so I stopped listening to audiobooks, and I found that I was remembering what I was reading much better. It's a shame because I actually have multiple eye conditions, and sometimes reading a text, even on my e-reader, which I sort of blow up the text on, but even that can sometimes be bad if my eyes are having a bad day. So audiobooks should be fantastic, right? But I end up not really remembering much afterwards. Even just a couple months, it begins to fade much sooner than when I read a text. So yeah, just these things of finding out what it was to read without a predetermined plan or these predetermined ideas of what my reading month was going to look like. In fact, divorcing the idea of reading from months, because BookTube was very focused on this is the month and you read the books in this month that you plan to read and then you talk about it at the end, you know. I could have books overlap weeks and days and take ages to read, and I could read a bit and then put it down and then pick it up later. It was a lot more free form, and that was really exciting. The second thing that I learned by stepping away was how my relationship to book hauls changed. Now, I never really had the money to do book hauls as they should be done. I was younger and I don't come from a particularly well-off family. And so I felt kind of weird, you know, I was kind of stretching my money to buy these books so that I could do the book hauls because that I was trying to replicate all of the cool people on BookTube that I was seeing, right? But by stepping away from that, I was able to buy way less, and I became very much a book minimalist. I really don't buy books at all anymore. I read predominantly from the library, both in physical and mostly ebook format. I switched to digital around this time, which was another sort of sense of freedom because BookTube is obviously very visual. You hold up books, and especially at that time, there wasn't really anyone online who was primarily a digital reader. Everyone who I had seen, you know, held up the books, and there's no book aesthetic tied to a purely digital reading life, but I felt free to explore that by stepping away, and I basically switched almost entirely to reading from the library and reading ebooks. I very rarely buy a physical book anymore, and that, I mean, it was probably a few months of transition, but relatively sudden. A relatively sharp change in my reading buying habits since stepping away from BookTube. Significant decrease in purchases, and then a switch to the library and to digital. I also stopped using Goodreads. Now, I'd used Goodreads diligently since 2013 because I thought, oh, it's a part of BookTube to be on Goodreads. I actually moved a lot of that information into my own spreadsheet. I made my own book spreadsheet and I started using that, and I actually didn't use Goodreads for a good, I'd say, year. I still had my account, but I didn't use it. I didn't add anything to it. I was just using my spreadsheet, and this was so much fun. And this, I think, tied into the buying less, because you can do a lot more on a spreadsheet than on Goodreads. I found Goodreads quite restricting in how you could organize your books with shelves and things. I like to do like color coding and all of this stuff on my spreadsheet, and by adding things to my spreadsheet, both what I had read but also what I had heard about and am interested in reading, adding it to my TBR on my spreadsheet filled that joy, that buzz of buying a book. And so these were kind of linked. Of stepping away from Goodreads and making my own spreadsheet was linked with me being able to not really craving purchasing as many books anymore. I don't actually get that much of a buzz from purchasing a book anymore because it's usually quite utilitarian, like, oh, I'm ready to read this book now. I shall buy it. It's I purchase them, and I really do kind of read them right away now. I don't buy more than I can read, and my wallet certainly is thankful for that. But it's made me been able to focus more on what I'm reading, because I'm not so stressed about what I've purchased and I haven't been getting to, and obviously everyone's different. But I really have appreciated not buying things that I don't read and that they sit and languish on my shelf. Now, obviously, I still have some books that are sitting on and languishing on my shelf because they're all the way pre-2016 when I still had much higher purchasing habits. There's still some sitting there. I've been chipping away at them, but since 2016, it's really been quite a line in the sand. Since that time, I've had a really good balance between purchasing books and reading them. And what's nice about this TBR spreadsheet is that I still cull it. I still go through and I declutter from my TBR list books that I'm no longer interested in. So it's not just this ever-growing list of, thousands of books. It actually stays right around, I'd say, about 200 books that I'm interested in, which is obviously more than I'm going to read at any one time. But it's a much more current reflection of where my interests lie now. I do find this spreadsheet far more helpful in actually deciding what to read next than buying books and then sitting on my shelves for a long time. But yeah, it's just been nice to focus on what I'm reading rather than what I'm acquiring. Insert literary pun here. I had a great video where she talked about this, where she said that in buying a lot of books, I'm treating myself in a way that will increase my anxiety later. And I think she phrased that perfectly. And comparably, by not buying a bunch of books and denying myself that certain joy in the moment, I'm increasing my excitement and my joy for books in general, because my excitement for reading has increased, my calmness has increased, and it's almost like that calmness is a blank slate for which excitement can then appear, rather than previously my excitement was kind of hemmed in by my anxiety. Number 3, this is a very long video, minimizing subscriptions was a big thing when I left Booktube. This was kind of painful because I love Booktube. I absolutely adore Booktube. I loved watching it. I still love watching it. It's my favorite place on the internet. I had over 100 subscriptions to different Booktube channels, probably more. I was really trying to find myself as a reader outside of that bookish internet world. And part of that was honestly about hearing about less books from less people. It was kind of overwhelming to hear about so many books all the time that I was genuinely interested in, but couldn't get to. I would say a good 2 years, I really minimized how much I was watching, cutting down to about maybe a dozen or so channels that I just really enjoyed. I think I'm probably up to more about 25 or 30 booktubers now, but it's still significantly less than it was when I was really into the community. I feel bad about not being a more active viewer because it's fun, right? But I also have to acknowledge that not watching so much about reading has made me read more. It's not only that I'm genuinely just spending more time reading than watching people talk about reading, but it also doesn't trigger that FOMO feeling all the time of, there's so many books I wish I was reading and I'm not, and I'm never going to get to, and we're all going to die, and we're never going to read everything before we die, and it's just that horrible feeling. If you're watching 80 plus booktubers, that's a lot of that feeling all the time, and it makes reading feel kind of futile almost, and stressful. And so lowering my subscription count really helped me just chill the fuck out and enjoy what I was reading and what I will get to read in my life. So it's sad that I can't be as active as I once was, but it has helped my reading. Number 4, being a slow reader. Like I said, I've always been a slow reader. Now, my reading has increased ever so slightly since I've become a more recreational reader, and I've been an avid reader now for a few years, but it's it's only marginal. I'm still a slower than average reader, and I do tend to read 2 to 3 books a month, which is less than a book a week. And I don't think I ever would have fully learned to accept myself as a slow reader if I didn't stop making booktube videos, because like I said, I had a real inferiority complex when I was a kid about being a slow reader, and then as soon as I started reading as an adult, it was deeply entangled with booktube, which is a very numbers focused place. Lots of people will put numbers in their titles and their thumbnails and on Goodreads, and they'll have end of year stats, and don't get me wrong, data is fun, and so tracking stuff, it's all good, but it's just a very number focused place, and by stepping away from that, there was just way less pressure. It was a mixture of stepping away from booktube, not making TBRs or wrap-ups anymore, and then also not using Goodreads in the way that I was. It kind of divorced reading from time. It didn't matter how long I took to read a book anymore. I didn't have a start and an end date on Goodreads. I'd be reading a book and I wouldn't know how long I'd been reading for. I'd be like, wait, when did I start this? Was it like last week, or was it the week before? Or how long? Because it didn't matter. I wasn't so hyper-focused on it anymore, and hyper-focused on fitting as much reading in my life as possible to try and match the numbers that I saw online. A lot of this is just because I was younger then, but I think stepping away let me grow up as a reader. You know, we have a lot of meticulous tracking in the booktube community. Again, it's really fun, but it triggered in me that sort of feeling of being back in primary school and looking at all the kids around me finishing their books much faster than me, and me not actually finishing the book I was interested in because I wanted to finish my book at the same time everyone else did, and I'd pretend I'd finished and I put it back before knowing the ending. And obviously that's just like my personal childhood, but I think stepping away, it actually let me kind of it sounds silly, but it let me heal some of those feelings of that self-consciousness of being a slow reader, and learn to trust myself to finish books, because guess what? I still finished a bunch of books, even though I wasn't making videos about them. I learned that I was a reader outside of booktube. I don't think we acknowledge the sadness or the frustration that can come with being a slow reader. You know, compared to other media-based hobbies like movies or TV shows, you know, they are a fixed set of time. You know, a movie that's 2 hours long is 2 hours long for me, and it's 2 hours long for you, right? And so there isn't that like inherent comparison of speed in the way that there is with reading. Obviously, there are people who watch more TV shows and films than others, but it doesn't have that inherent sort of race quality, because you can't do it any faster than someone else. It's just about how much of your time you want to fill with it, you know? Whereas for me, if I read for 2 hours a day and I get through 40 pages, someone else who's read for 2 hours a day could get through 300. And that feeling, it feels bad sometimes to just not be able to read as many books as you would like. And often, you know, booktube is structured around, often had readathons and challenges and things, and they're not necessarily super accommodating to slow readers. You know, I think a lot of those feelings I was having of inferiority were coming from me, but I also do think booktube just has a huge focus on numbers, because numbers are fun. But where is that line between data for the fun of data and a focus on optimization and tracking and making everything numerical in this sort of productivity focused world that we live in? You know, where is that line? And maybe that line is very blurry, and I think it overlaps a lot sometimes. I think in a certain way, the whole data being fun thing felt like almost just another thing that I couldn't participate in as a slow reader, because I didn't have enough numbers to have as much a vibrant data, you know? For a couple of years, I just really wasn't. I was tracking what I was reading in the sense I was writing it down, but I wasn't counting what I was reading. I think that was a big improvement for me. So number 5, booktube clouded my reading motivation. why was I reading what I was reading? So what I mean by this is that to a certain extent, at the end of my booktube time in 2016, I was thinking a lot about what I was going to say at the end of month wrap up when I was reading the books, right? Which is not a bad thing. It's like, what do I think about this as I'm reading it? That's not, a bad question, but I was thinking about it. How would I articulate this? I was imagining myself sitting in front of the camera and making my wrap up as I was reading the book. I hadn't even finished it yet. I feel like it really hemmed in what I was experiencing from the books. Like, it was like I was only allowing myself to experience the book in a way that I could articulate in a wrap up. But there are many other ways to experience a book. I just finished reading A Swim in a Pond in the Rain by George Saunders, where he sort of breaks down 7 Russian short stories. And something that he says in there, we're always rationally explaining and articulating things, but we're at our most intelligent in the moment just before we start to explain or articulate. Great art occurs, or doesn't, in that instant. What we turn to art for is precisely this moment, when we know something, we feel it, but can't articulate it because it's too complex and multiple. But the knowing at such moments, though happening without language, is real. I'd say this is what art is for, to remind us that this other sort of knowing is not only real, it's superior to our usual conceptual, reductive way. That really spoke to me. I think that's what I was missing. I'd gotten so into the habit of making these wrap-ups and articulating my thoughts for booktube that I cut off experiences of reading that I couldn't articulate to booktube. It was like that was just missing from my reading experience. Also, my reading had been so wrapped up in booktube that it kind of clouded, well, why was I reading? Was I reading to read? Or was I reading to be a part of booktube? Because I loved booktube, like I said. I really loved it. And sometimes it felt like I loved booktube more than I loved books. And I don't think that's inherently wrong, but it did just make me feel a bit uncomfortable. So by stepping back, and the fact that my reading didn't stop, I still read. I read differently. That's what I'm talking about. But it was confirmation for me that, yeah, it is the books I'm interested in. Because remember, I'd not been an adult who'd read recreationally without booktube for very long at all. So this was a real affirmation for me that, yeah, I guess I am a reader now. I guess I am a proper reader, because it's not engaging with bookish content online anymore. It's just the books. And I'm still here for it. I'm still interested. That was really exciting. It was good for me to be a reader without being a booktuber, at least for a time. On booktube, I had to have a very clear experience of a book. It was like, this is what I felt, this is what I experienced, this is what I think. And I'm going to tell you, right? So I had to have a really clear experience, but I had this kind of blurry, murky motivation. Okay, why am I reading this? Whereas when I left booktube, suddenly I had a really clear motivation. I knew why I was reading it, because I wanted to read it. It was really that simple. There was no ulterior motive, and I knew that because there was nothing to gain out of reading the stuff other than reading the stuff. But the experience sort of became a bit more blurry. I didn't have to articulate things, and I began to experience reading in a way that is that knowing before you start to rationalize what you've experienced from a book. And it was a certain kind of magic. So number 6 is I struggled with reviewing books. That I did. Now, admittedly, I was young. I think I'd be better at articulating it now. But, reviewing books is really hard. There are some excellent book reviewers here on BookTube, and it is a skill. And I think that it was really hard for me. The biggest thing I had was to articulate my experience with a book. Like I said, I that's what wrap-ups and things were for. But how do you do that without spoiling things? Because a lot of my thoughts and feelings of a book were based on how it ended or things that happened in the book. So how did I fully talk about my experience without ruining the book for the person watching the video? That was something that I really struggled with. I still think that that's a real hurdle in making excellent reviews. Some people are fantastic at it. I think Olive at A Book Olive, she does that brilliantly. She tells you what the book is about and what her thoughts are, but it never feels like she spoils a book. But for me, with media is very interlinked for me. I'll read this and then it'll make me think of that. It'll make me think of this movie or this other book or this TV show or this random thing that I saw that day. It's very interweaved, and so my thoughts on books are very interweaved with these other things that I've consumed. And so I found it difficult to do a review like that, because my review would be based in not just the thoughts on this one piece of media, it would be on like 5. And how do you make a review like that? For me, I relate media to other pieces of media, like the underside of a tapestry. They're all weaved together, and when you tug and you pull on one, you're pulling on a bunch of others. And that is what I love. That is what I love. Like, I am building a interconnected web of how I think and feel based on my reading, and it's wonderful. But how do you capture that in a review? I found that really difficult, and I fully admit that this is me not having great reviewing skills, but that struggle made making booktube videos kind of stressful. I also just kind of felt awkward in front of a camera. The deep irony is that I'm actually a really good public speaker. I don't say that arrogantly. I'm really good in front of a group of people if I know. Obviously not so much improv, but if I know what I'm talking about, I'm really good at talking to people. I actually really enjoy it. But there's something about camera work that gets into my head. It's like a camera is etched in stone. You know, public speaking is momentary. If you make a mistake, you can change the energy, the rhythm of the room just by making a joke or acknowledging something or whatever. It's just in that moment, and you just have to keep the vibe and the energy up in whatever you're speaking about, so that people keep engaging, and you have that feedback of the people watching you. But a camera, there's no one else there. It's etched in stone. I think it's just a very different rhythm than actual public speaking, and I think this came about in a self-consciousness of my appearance, of how I was coming across in the videos and things like that just made me awkward, and then obviously made me more self-conscious about my awkwardness, and it was just this vicious cycle. I felt very conscious of me in the videos, which, if I compare that to public speaking, I kind of become invisible. I become this sort of conduit to whatever I'm speaking about, and it's all about the audience and are they engaged and are they getting it. I feel almost not invisible, but my appearance doesn't matter. I'm not thinking about myself, I'm thinking about the process. Whereas in front of the camera, I really felt self-conscious and kind of restricted in that medium. But yeah, I think just as a young person, having my reading so entangled with booktube from the very beginning, it was really nice to step back. I feel like my reading is my reading now, rather than this external formula that I was placing on myself. And again, I want to be really clear here. This isn't a take down booktube video. Like, I still absolutely love booktube. It's still my favorite place on the internet. I'm not just sharing my experiences of what it was like. So that's it. They are all the thoughts I had. Actually, I lie. There is one last thought, which is, as much as there were all these problems that I felt with booktube, or at least my experience with booktube, I do miss talking about books. You know, I still read, and I still have a lot of thoughts. You know, like I said, I have room for those murkier book experiences now, but I still have thoughts that I would like to articulate and share with others and have those book discussions. I miss talking about books. I miss having a place to put my thoughts on books, because, you know, my friends and family, their reception to me waffling on about whatever I'm reading about, it wanes. You know, my poor mother, she gets all my yakking on whatever I'm reading about, and she's so generous. Anyway, it's not just that I miss expressing my thoughts, I miss feeling like I am participating in a community. That is fun. The problem is, I'm a little nervous about engaging back with booktube, because how do I get those positives without bringing all those negatives back that I've just been talking about? So, you know, I do have an inclination to return, but I think I need to experiment with how I did it, because I don't think the formulaic video thing works for me. I barely buy books anymore. Where would I talk about that? I think I definitely prefer just being audio, But then no one wants to watch just an audio video when there's no video there, you know. Booktube is a community, and part of community is having a face to a voice, having a face to ideas, and I get that. I'm worried that if I just do pure audio, there is that inherent personness lacking. So this isn't, you know, some declaration of my return. It's merely just a discussion of my departure. So anyway, that was all. This is very long. Thank you for watching. If you made it to the end, you're amazing.